Welcome back to Footnotes and Folly, and to the close of Book 6. I am Pemberton, this is Part 31. With the temple gone, the rebels John of Gishala and Simon son of Juras fall back, doing a great deal of mischief and suffering many misfortunes, and Caesar makes himself master of the lower city by fire. Then he raises his banks about the steep upper city on Mount Zion, brings up his engines, and possesses himself of the whole of it. At last Jerusalem is wholly taken and given over to destruction, and Josephus sets down the orders Titus gave within the captured city, the number of the captives, and of those who perished in the whole siege, and the fate of those who hid in the underground caverns, among them the 2 tyrants themselves. Let us finish the book.
The Seditious now rushed into the royal palace, where many people had placed their possessions because it was so strong, and they drove the Romans away from it. They also killed all the people who had crowded into it, about 8,400 in number, and plundered what they had. They took 2 Romans alive as well, one a horseman and the other a footman. Then they cut the footman's throat and immediately dragged him through the whole city, as though they were avenging themselves on the entire Roman body through this one example. But the horseman said that he had something to suggest to them for their preservation. Because of this he was brought before Simon. When he had nothing to say after he arrived there, Simon handed him over to one of his commanders, Ardalus, to be punished. Ardalus bound his hands behind him, put a band over his eyes, and brought him out opposite the Romans, intending to cut off his head. But the man prevented the execution, and ran away to the Romans while the Jewish executioner was drawing his sword. When he had escaped from the enemy, Titus could not bring himself to put him to death. Yet because he judged the man unworthy to remain a Roman soldier any longer, since he had been taken alive by the enemy, he took away his arms and expelled him from the legion to which he had belonged. To someone with a sense of shame, this was a penalty more severe than death itself. On the next day, the Romans drove the robbers out of the lower city and set everything on fire as far as Siloam. These soldiers were glad to see the city destroyed, but they missed the plunder, because the Seditious had carried off all their possessions and withdrawn into the upper city. Even now they did not repent at all of the mischiefs they had done, but were insolent, as if they had acted well. As they watched the city burning, they appeared cheerful and put on joyful expressions, saying that they expected death to end their miseries. So now the people had been slain, the holy house had been burned down, and the city was on fire. There was nothing further left for the enemy to do. Yet even in this utmost extremity Josephus did not grow weary of begging them to spare what was left of the city. He spoke at length to them about their barbarity and impiety, and gave them advice for their escape. But he gained nothing by it except to be laughed at by them. They could not bring themselves to surrender because of the oath they had taken, and they were no longer strong enough to fight the Romans in open battle, since they were surrounded on every side and were already a kind of prisoners. Still, they were so accustomed to killing people that they could not restrain their right hands from acting accordingly. So they scattered themselves before the city and lay in ambush among its ruins to catch those who tried to desert to the Romans. Many such deserters were caught by them, and all were killed, for their lack of food had made them too weak to flee. Their dead bodies were thrown to the dogs. Every other kind of death was now thought more tolerable than famine. Thus, even though the Jews now despaired of mercy, they still fled to the Romans, and some even willingly fell among the murderous rebels themselves. There was no place in the city without dead bodies in it, but every place was entirely covered with those killed either by famine or by the rebellion. Everything was full of the dead bodies of those who had perished by that sedition or by that famine. The last hope that now supported the tyrants and the crew of robbers with them lay in the caves and underground caverns. If they could once flee there, they did not expect to be searched for. Their plan was that after the whole city had been destroyed and the Romans had gone away, they would come out again and escape from them. This was nothing better than a dream of theirs, for they could not lie hidden either from God or from the Romans. Nevertheless, they depended on these underground hiding places and set more places on fire than the Romans themselves did. Those who fled out of their houses, which had been set on fire in this way, into the ditches, they killed without mercy and plundered as well. If they found food belonging to anyone, they seized it and swallowed it down together with their blood. Indeed, they had now come to fighting one another over their plunder. I cannot help thinking that, if their destruction had not prevented it, their barbarity would have made them taste even the dead bodies themselves. When Caesar saw that the upper city was so steep that it could not possibly be taken without raising banks against it, he divided the several parts of that work among his army. This was on the 20th day of the month Lus or Ab. Carrying the materials was difficult, since, as I have already told you, all the trees around the city within a distance of 100 furlongs had already had their branches cut off to make the former banks. The works belonging to the 4 legions were erected on the west side of the city, opposite the royal palace. But the whole body of auxiliary troops, with the rest of the multitude that was with them, erected their banks at the Xystus, from where they reached to the bridge, and to that tower of Simon which he had built as a citadel for himself against John when they were at war with one another. At this time the commanders of the Idumeans gathered together privately and took counsel about surrendering themselves to the Romans. Accordingly, they sent 5 men to Titus and begged him to give them his right hand as security. Titus thought that if the Idumeans, on whom a great part of the war depended, were once withdrawn from the tyrants would yield. After some reluctance and delay he agreed to their request, gave them security for their lives, and sent the 5 men back. But as these Idumeans were preparing to march out, Simon discovered it. He immediately killed the 5 men who had gone to Titus, seized their commanders, and put them in prison. The most eminent among them was Jacob, the son of Soses. As for the multitude of the Idumeans, who did not know at all what to do now that their commanders had been taken from them, Simon had them watched and secured the walls with a larger garrison. Yet that garrison could not resist those who were deserting. Although a great number of deserters were killed, many more escaped. They were all received by the Romans, both because Titus himself grew negligent about his former orders to kill them, and because the soldiers themselves grew weary of killing them, and because they hoped to get money by sparing them. They left only the common people alone and sold the rest of the multitude, with their wives and children, each of them at a very low price, because those sold were very many and the buyers were few. Although Titus had previously proclaimed that no deserter should come alone by himself, so that they might bring their families out with them, he nevertheless received even such people as these. However, he set men over them to distinguish one from another, in order to see if any deserved punishment. The number of those sold was immense, but more than 40,000 of the populace were saved, and Caesar let each of them go wherever he pleased. At this time one of the priests, the son of the Buthus, whose name was Jesus, came out after receiving security by Caesar's oath that he would be preserved, on condition that he delivered to him certain precious things that had been stored in the temple. From the wall of the holy house he delivered to Titus 2 candlesticks like those that lay in the holy house, along with tables, cisterns, and vials, all made of solid gold and very heavy. He also delivered to him the veils and the garments, together with the precious stones and a great number of other precious vessels that belonged to their sacred worship. The treasurer of the temple, whose name was Flavius, was also seized and showed Titus the coats and girdles of the priests, along with a great quantity of purple and scarlet that had been stored there for use in the veil, and also a great deal of cinnamon and cassia, with a large quantity of other sweet spices, which used to be mixed together and offered every day as incense to God. Many other treasures were also delivered to him, along with not a few sacred ornaments of the temple. These things, delivered in this way to Titus, obtained for this man the same pardon that Titus had allowed to those who deserted of their own accord. The banks were finished on the 7th day of the month Corpius, or Elul, after 18 days. Then the Romans brought their machines against the wall. As for the seditious, some of them, despairing of saving the city, withdrew from the wall to the citadel. Others went down into the subterranean vaults. Still, a great many defended themselves against those who brought the engines for the battery. Yet the Romans overcame them by their number and by their strength, and above all because they went cheerfully about their work, while the Jews were utterly dejected and had become weak. As soon as part of the wall was battered down, and certain towers yielded to the blows of the battering rams, those who opposed them fled away. Such terror fell upon the tyrants, far greater than the occasion required, that before the enemy had crossed the breach they were completely stunned, and were immediately ready to flee. Now one could see these men, who had until then been so insolent and arrogant in their wicked practices, cast down and trembling. It would have moved one's heart to pity to observe the change that had come over those vile persons. Accordingly, they rushed violently toward the Roman wall that surrounded them, intending to force away those who guarded it, break through, and escape. But when they saw that those who had formerly been faithful to them had gone away, for they had fled wherever the great distress they were in persuaded them to flee, and when those who came running before the rest told them that the western wall was entirely overthrown, while others said the Romans had gotten in, and others said they were near and looking for them, which were only the dictates of fear imposing upon their sight, they fell on their faces and bitterly lamented their own mad conduct. Their nerves were so terribly loosened that they could not flee. Here one may chiefly reflect on the power of God exercised upon these wicked wretches, and on the good fortune of the Romans. For these tyrants now wholly deprived themselves of the security they had in their own power, and came down of their own accord from those very towers in which they could never have been taken by force, nor indeed by any other means than famine. Thus the Romans, after taking such great pains over weaker walls, obtained by good fortune what they could never have obtained by their engines. 3 of these towers were too strong for any mechanical engines whatsoever, as we have described above. So they left these towers by themselves, or rather they were driven out of them by God himself, and fled immediately to the valley below Siloam. There they recovered themselves for a little while from the terror they were in, and ran violently against the part of the Roman wall that lay on that side. But their courage was too depressed for them to make their attacks with enough force, and their power had now been broken by fear and affliction. They were therefore repulsed by the guards, and scattering at a distance from one another, went down into the subterranean caverns. The Romans, now masters of the walls, placed their ensigns upon the towers and made joyful acclamations for the victory they had won, since they found the end of this war much lighter than its beginning. When they had gotten onto the last wall without bloodshed, they could hardly believe that what they found was true. Seeing nobody to oppose them, they stood in doubt as to what such an unusual solitude could mean. But when they went in numbers into the lanes of the city with their swords drawn, they killed those whom they overtook and set fire to the houses into which the Jews had fled, burning every soul in them. They laid waste many of the rest as well. When they came to the houses to plunder them, they found in them whole families of dead men, and the upper rooms full of dead corpses, those who had died by famine. They stood in horror at the sight, and went out without touching anything. Yet although they had this pity for those destroyed in that way, they did not have the same pity for those who were still alive. They ran through everyone they met, blocked the very lanes with their dead bodies, and made the whole city run down with blood, to such a degree that the fire in many of the houses was quenched by these men's blood. And truly it happened that although the slayers stopped in the evening, the fire greatly prevailed during the night. As everything burned, the 8th day of the month Gorpius, or Elul, came upon Jerusalem, a city that had suffered so many miseries during the siege that, if it had always enjoyed as much happiness from its first foundation, it would certainly have been the envy of the world. Nor did it deserve these severe misfortunes for any reason so much as because it produced such a generation of men as were the cause of its overthrow. When Titus came into the upper city, he admired not only some of its other strong places, but especially those powerful towers that the tyrants, in their madness, had abandoned. When he saw their solid height, the size of their individual stones, the exactness of their joints, and also how great their breadth was and how extensive their length, he spoke in this way: "We have certainly had God as our assistant in this war, and it was none other than God who drove the Jews out of these fortifications. For what could the hands of men, or any machines, do toward overthrowing these towers?" At that time he had many such conversations with his friends. He also set free those who had been bound by the tyrants and left in the prisons. Finally, when he entirely demolished the rest of the city and overthrew its walls, he left these towers standing as a monument of his good fortune, which had proved to be his ally and had enabled him to take what he could not otherwise have taken. Since his soldiers were already quite tired of killing men, and yet there still appeared to be a vast multitude alive, Caesar ordered that they should kill only those who were armed and opposed them, but should take the rest alive. Nevertheless, along with those whom they had orders to kill, they also killed the aged and the infirm. As for those in the prime of life who might be useful to them, they drove them together into the temple and shut them within the walls of the court of the women. Over these Caesar set one of his freedmen, and also Fronto, one of his own friends, who was to determine each person's fate according to his merits. So Fronto killed all those who had been seditious and robbers, after they were accused by one another. Of the young men he chose the tallest and most beautiful, and reserved them for the triumph. As for the rest of the multitude who were more than 17 years old, he put them in chains and sent them to the Egyptian mines. Titus also sent a great number into the provinces as a present to them, so that they might be destroyed in their theaters by the sword and by wild beasts. Those under 17 years of age were sold as slaves. During the days when Fronto was separating these men, 11,000 perished for lack of food. Some of them did not taste any food because of the hatred their guards bore them, and others would not take any when it was given to them. The multitude was also so very great that there was not even enough grain for their sustenance. The number of those carried captive during this whole war was reckoned to be 97,000, and the number of those who perished during the whole siege was 1,100,000. The greater part of them were indeed of the same nation as the citizens of Jerusalem, but they did not belong to the city itself. They had come up from all the country to the feast of unleavened bread, and were suddenly shut in by an army. This, from the very beginning, caused such crowding among them that a pestilential destruction came upon them, and soon afterward a famine that destroyed them more suddenly. That this city could contain so many people is clear from the number taken under Seditious. He wanted to inform Nero of the power of the city, since Nero was otherwise inclined to despise that nation, and he asked the high priests, if possible, to count the whole multitude. So these high priests, when the feast called the Passover came, at which they slay their sacrifices from the 9th hour to the 11th, and when a company of not fewer than 10 belongs to each sacrifice, since it is not lawful for them to feast alone by themselves, and many of us are 20 in a company, found that the number of sacrifices was 250, 6,500. Allowing no more than 10 persons to feast together at each sacrifice, this amounts to 2,700,200 persons who were pure and holy. Those with leprosy or gonorrhea, women in their monthly courses, and any others who are polluted are not permitted to partake of this sacrifice, nor are foreigners who come here to worship. This vast multitude was indeed gathered from distant places, but the whole nation was now shut up by fate as if in prison, and the Roman army surrounded the city when it was crowded with inhabitants. Accordingly, the multitude of those who perished there exceeded all the destructions that either men or God had ever brought upon the world. To speak only of what was publicly known, the Romans killed some of them, carried some away captive, and searched for others underground. When they found where they were, they broke open the ground and killed everyone they met. There were also found there more than 2,000 persons who had been killed, partly by their own hands, partly by one another, but chiefly destroyed by famine. The bad smell of the dead bodies was most offensive to those who came upon them, so that some were forced to leave immediately. Others, however, were so greedy for gain that they went among the heaps of dead bodies and walked over them, for a great deal of treasure was found in these caverns, and the hope of gain made every method of getting it seem lawful. Many of those whom the tyrants had put in prison were now brought out, for the tyrants had not stopped their barbarous cruelty even at the very end. Yet God avenged himself on them both in a way agreeable to justice. As for John, he lacked food together with his brothers in these caverns, and begged the Romans to give him the right hand for his security, which he had often proudly rejected before. Simon struggled hard with the distress he was in, but he too was forced to surrender himself, as we shall relate hereafter. So Simon was reserved for the triumph and then to be killed, while John was condemned to perpetual imprisonment. The Romans now set fire to the outer parts of the city, burned them down, and entirely demolished its walls. Thus Jerusalem was taken in the 2nd year of the reign of Vespasian, on the 8th day of the month Gorpaius, or Elul. It had been taken 5 times before, though this was the 2nd time it was made desolate. Shishak, king of Egypt, and after him Antiochus, and after him Pompey, and after them Sosius and Herod, took the city but still preserved it. But before all these, the king of Babylon conquered it and made it desolate, 1,468 years and 6 months after it was built. The man who first built it was a powerful man among the Canaanites, and in our own tongue he is called Melchizedek, the righteous king, for such he really was. For this reason he was the first priest of God there, and he first built a temple there, and called the city Jerusalem, which had formerly been called Salem. However, David, the king of the Jews, drove out the Canaanites and settled his own people there. It was demolished entirely by the Babylonians 477 years and 6 months after him. From King David, who was the first of the Jews to reign there, to this destruction under Titus, there were 1,179 years. From its first building to this last destruction there were 2,177 years. Yet neither its great antiquity, nor its vast riches, nor the spread of its nation over all the habitable earth, nor the greatness of the religious reverence paid to it, was enough to preserve it from being destroyed. Thus ended the siege of Jerusalem.
And the book 6 ends with Jerusalem fallen, the temple burned, and the survivors led away in chains, the war all but over, though not quite. In book 7, Josephus carries us to the Roman triumph in which the spoils of the temple are paraded through the city, and out to the desert rock of Masada, where the very last of the rebels make their final, terrible stand. Thank you for sitting with the fall of the Holy City. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.